Hi, and welcome to this webinar on strategic planning amid COVID-19, an action-oriented approach. My name is Erin Bass. I'll go a little bit more into my introduction in just a moment, but what we want to share in today's webinar is really the things that leaders can do to help propel their strategy forward in the midst of this pandemic. So I'm an associate professor of strategy in the College of Business Administration at University of Nebraska, Omaha. I also hold a faculty in residence at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and I help lead our campus as the James R. Schumacher Chair in Ethics. I have professional experience in both the energy and the nonprofit sectors, and so you'll hear some of that experience come out in today's webinar. I've also done extensive consulting and executive education for energy, government contracting, healthcare, information technology, insurance, nonprofits, transportation, and logistics. So hopefully that wide swath of experience that I have will help provide insight that are relevant for a variety of sectors. And then my research focus is really on strategy, leadership, and ethics. So I'm really excited to have you here today to listen to the webinar. So before we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the current state that we're in. So this is from a recent report by the Nebraska Business Development Center on COVID-19's impact on Nebraska business. So we know that COVID-19 has touched every geographic area and industry inside of Nebraska. Of those that responded, 87% indicated that it's negatively impacted their area and industry. 89% of them have indicated decreased revenues. Yet of those 89%, most are trying to maintain their costs. And what we're getting at here with maintaining costs is they're trying to keep people employed. They're trying to continue with their supply chain efforts, their support of their resources. So we'll talk a little bit about what that squeeze looks like and how you can potentially make a strategy to help with that squeeze. We also know that there's at least 3 key issues that have been identified from that report. The first is respondents are worried about the impact of COVID-19 on their operations and finances. So from a strategy perspective, we know that that's an internal attribute that they're worried about, but they're also worried about the duration of the outbreak, so how long this is going to last, and not just the pandemic itself, but rules about social distancing and this kind of new normal that we're operating in. And so from a strategy perspective, we would attribute that as something external to the business. And then consumer confidence and spending, again, would be another external factor that would be impactful for strategy. So the purpose of this webinar is really to consider the impact of COVID-19 on strategic planning. And we're going to adopt an action-oriented approach. Really what I've done here is provide questions for leaders about how they might move forward. So sometimes we think about strategic plans as being these documents that are created once a year or once every few years and then never revisited. I'm a firm believer that strategic planning should be dynamic and it should be ongoing. And so when I'm talking about strategic planning in this webinar, I'm really referencing the idea of how strategy is influencing our everyday operations and how things that are happening in our environment, like COVID-19, should impact the way that we think about our strategy, but how our strategy can help us move forward. And so the final point of the webinar today will be to identify how we can use strategy to respond, restore, and thrive now and in the future. So 3 things that we want to talk about today: how COVID-19 affects strategic planning, so kind of getting that broad idea of how it's going to impact our strategy or how we might think about that. We might think then about ways that it will actually affect the key parts of our strategy. So I'm specifically going to talk about growth and competitive positioning here as kind of 2 items of strategy that we might consider in reference to COVID-19. And then finally, we're going to talk about what to do about our current strategy. So let me move into that first idea of how COVID-19 affects strategic planning. When we think about strategy, we can think about it as being multi-layered. So I've kind of broken down at least 4 layers of strategy when we think about creating a strategy within our organization. So the first level of our strategy is our enterprise strategy, and it really helps answer that question of what is our strategic purpose. So anyone who's been involved in creating a vision, creating a mission, going through our values, goals, and objectives, that all is really encompassed in that enterprise strategy level. The enterprise strategy then kind of influences all of the subsequent layers of strategy. So if we think of it this way, our vision and our mission is going to impact the ways that we grow. It's going to impact our decisions about how we position ourselves in the marketplace, how we allocate resources, etc. So that enterprise strategy really should define our strategic purpose. Then we move into the next level of strategy, which is our corporate strategy, and talks about our strategic direction. And for most organizations, our strategic direction is to grow. Now, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, that might not be a reality. So in a few slides, we're going to talk about what additional strategic direction considerations we might take. So when we think about our corporate strategy, then we can grow by examining the kinds of markets that we compete, where we're competing in the value chain, the products and the services that we're offering. So it really gets at those multiple businesses or multiple ways that we are achieving growth in our organization. The next level of strategy is our business level strategy, and this really gets down to the question of what is our strategic position. And so this is thinking about not where we compete, but how we compete, either as a low-cost provider or potentially we're differentiated in some way. And then that final layer of strategy really gets into the execution part of strategy. So that's our functional and operational strategy. So our finance strategy, our marketing strategy, HR strategy, operations strategy, IT strategy, right? All of those different components or functions of the organization have their own strategies that should be aligned with our enterprise, our corporate, and our business strategy. So thinking about how we execute our strategy and how we allocate or develop our resources to execute those upper levels of strategy. So brief overview on the various levels of strategy. Then if we move into this AFI framework that we use for strategic planning, we start with first analyzing the external and internal environment and thinking about how that impacts the way we formulate our strategy at the enterprise, corporate, business, and functional and operational levels, and then how those things are implemented through our leadership and execution. Well, when we think about COVID-19, it really gets into that analysis portion of our strategic planning. That first A in the AFI framework helps us to diagnose the competitive challenge that we're facing and analyze our organization's internal and external environments. Well, when we think about COVID-19, it really is something that's happened in the external environment that has impact or should impact the way that we formulate our strategy. So when I talk about the external environment, I'm talking about things outside of our organization's borders, and we would typically call these opportunities and threats. So consumer preferences or consumer spending, we know that's one of the key issues identified in that report that I mentioned earlier. So that would be a threat for most organizations. Public health right now, we know that's a big kind of factor in the external environment that, maybe 6 months ago, a lot of businesses, it wouldn't have even been something that would be on our radar. And then new regulations. So I'm thinking about the restaurant industry and how these new regulations have really impacted the way that these organizations operate. And then we might also think about internally, so things within the organization that might impact how we create or how we formulate our strategy. So supply chain is one of the biggest issues that we know right now. Breaks in the supply chain or challenges within the supply chain have created supply chain weaknesses for a lot of organizations. Human resources, and we'll talk about that in a second, and then also planning in our systems. So hopefully thinking about how COVID-19 impacts our strategic planning will help us leverage that strength of planning so that we can create a strategy that will help us respond and thrive in this new environment that we're operating in. So this COVID-19 pandemic, we would think about it as being something external to our organization. You know, most businesses, well, all businesses have no control over it, but it is impacting all businesses differently. So again, referencing that report that I mentioned in the first couple of slides, the majority of businesses have been negatively impacted by COVID-19. Potentially there's some businesses that are positively impacted, but the idea is that all businesses are impacted, but in a slightly maybe different way. And so really what we're thinking about here then is COVID-19 affects strategic planning because it's a shift or a change in that external environment. And when we analyze that shift or that change for our business, that understanding or that analysis should help us be able to create a strategy that will help us respond and thrive to those changes in the external environment. So moving on then to talk about ways that COVID-19 will affect strategy or has already affected strategy. If we go into that AFI framework now, I specifically want to focus on two layers of strategy for everyone to think about in terms of how that shift in the external environment, it might change our strategies both at the corporate level and at the business level moving forward so that we can be successful. So I mentioned earlier, the majority of businesses are focused on a growth strategy when they talk about their strategic direction, when they talk about their corporate strategy. So when we talk about a growth strategy, we're talking about new markets that we can enter, new products or services that we could offer, market penetration. You know, these are all ways that businesses grow. And so I have a little chart here that talks about the multiple ways that businesses could grow through what we would call a concentration strategy, or that's really a market penetration strategy, through vertical integration. So that's moving up or down the supply chain, buying or aligning with buyers and suppliers. And then also diversification. So diversification in terms of adding new products or services to our existing portfolio, or potentially even adding new markets, so geographic markets to our portfolio as well. So potentially a lot of us were sitting in a place 6 months ago, a year ago, when we're thinking about strategic planning, and most of us would have been planning out a growth strategy because we know this is what most organizations do. Given those shifts that have happened in the external environment, a growth strategy might not be feasible right now. So we might actually think about moving, when we think about our strategic planning, moving into a stability strategy. So I have kind of 3 different stability strategies here. So the first would be pause and proceed with caution. So this is basically where we're taking our existing strategy and pressing the pause button on it, so not making any changes, waiting to see how this external environment is going to shift, and then we'll be able to respond to those shifts. Stability strategy could also be a no change strategy. So potentially if you found yourself in a growth strategy before, you might be transitioning into a new strategy in which you're not seeking out growth. So you're just trying to kind of make ends meet with your current strategy. And then we also know what we might call a profit-centered strategy, which wouldn't necessarily be looking at growth from a revenue standpoint, but instead would be maintaining the profitability that we've had, and so identifying ways that we can be more profitable, or in this case, probably maintaining our profitability. So we might see some transitions from growth strategies into stability strategies. We might also see some transitions into retrenchment strategies. So this could be an opportunity where we see a lot of businesses move into turnaround strategies, where you're essentially identifying things that are not working in your existing strategy or existing operations and trying to turn your organization around given this pandemic. We could see a captive company or sellout divestment strategy. So I would suspect that we're going to see a lot of, especially bigger organizations, start to divest assets, businesses, products, services that really are not making those revenue goals or those profitability goals. And then, of course, bankruptcy and liquidation would also fall under a retrenchment strategy. So we can kind of think about the question that I would ask for leaders is, can we continue a growth strategy? And if the answer is no, then what are we going to do? Are we going to move into a stability or a retrenchment strategy? And what would the kind of underlying strategy for either of those corporate directions be? The second layer of strategy that will be impacted by COVID-19 is our business level strategy, or how we compete. And we typically say there's two ways that organizations can compete. They can either compete by being low cost or by being differentiated in some way. So when we think about that differentiation strategy, we know that there's these sources of competitive advantage when we're pursuing a differentiation strategy. So when we're maybe charging a premium price or have new product features because we're pursuing this differentiation strategy, there's some value associated with that. So the first could be, that there's product features, and so we're able to have a premium price for that, or the quality or reliability of our products is providing us with a differentiation strategy, potentially convenience, firm customer relationships, and then firm linkages, potentially with our suppliers or other competitors, collaborators in the marketplace. So we already know that those are the sources of competitive advantage if we're pursuing a differentiation strategy. What I'm illustrating here with these arrows are potential ways that COVID-19 might impact those sources of competitive advantage. So if we are pursuing a differentiation strategy with our source of competitive advantage of being the quality or reliability of our services that we offer, or the product that we offer, we might potentially see some erosion of that competitive advantage just because of changes in supply chain, changes in human resources, changes in our ability to have access to capital. Similarly with convenience, a lot of these changes with regulations have really impacted a lot of businesses' ability to be available and open to consumers. So if we're pursuing a differentiation strategy and those are maybe one of the sources of our advantage, we might really want to think about, is there a different source of competitive advantage that we could leverage now and maybe potentially in the future? I have these kind of green arrows here as maybe identifying opportunities that could be capitalized on or leveraged. So thinking about product features, we know a lot of clothing manufacturers obviously have entered into a new era of providing cloth masks. So that would just be one example of us being able to broaden the product features that we offer. I have this telehealth example over here too. So thinking about how healthcare providers have maybe shifted their ability to be able to provide services, even though telehealth has always been there or been there for quite some time now, given the shifts in the external environment, it's something that we can really leverage today. Similarly, those firm customer relationships. So thinking about how important those relationships are to our ability to succeed, and how can we maintain those relationships now and in the future so that they can still be a source of our competitive advantage. So when we think about that differentiation strategy, then, going back to that Nebraska Business Development Center report that was provided, talking about how revenues have decreased for a lot of businesses, but the expenses haven't decreased at all. So I've kind of illustrated that here in these first two bar charts here. So this is potentially our pre-COVID-19. So here's our revenues up here in this top line and our costs kind of down here with the red line. We see everything in here being our profitability or our value that we've created. Well, knowing that revenues have shifted down, we see that value or that profitability that we previously enjoyed is maybe not so large. So moving forward then, for organizations pursuing a differentiation strategy, we want to really think about, if our revenue kind of stays here the way that it is currently, what are some things that we could do to potentially lower those costs so that we can achieve similar profitability to what we had before? Or Are there new things that we could offer, new products, services, markets, etc., new supply chains that we could enter into so that we could potentially restore some of that profitability that we had pre-COVID-19 while keeping our costs the same? So things to think about moving forward. Looking at the low-cost strategy then, sources of competitive advantage, we know cost of input factors, economies of scale, learning curve effects, and experience curve effects. Now, if we're pursuing a low-cost strategy, those learning curve effects and those experience curve effects really are not necessarily impacted by this, this pandemic. If anything, and I'll talk about this in a few slides, it's enabling us to achieve more learning and achieve more experience. So there's potential insights that could be leveraged there. For businesses pursuing a low-cost strategy, though, if our source of competitive advantage is the cost of input factors or economies of scale, you know, those kinds of sources would be most impacted by COVID-19 simply because of supply chain issues. The ability to get the raw materials or get the supplies that we need in order to create the products or services that we can sell. But then also economies of scale, knowing that consumer spending is down, knowing that people are not maybe purchasing as much. Our ability to produce at those higher levels and achieve economies of scale might be threatened right now. So thinking about if cost of input factors or economies of scale are sources of competitive advantage, potentially thinking about how we might rework those competitive advantages so that we're not put at a disadvantage amid COVID-19. So similarly, thinking about that low-cost strategy, here we are with pre-COVID-19. We have our revenues, top line, our costs being the red line. Now for these organizations, we know that a lot of businesses that are pursuing a low-cost strategy, their revenues have similarly gone down, but their costs may have increased, especially if they were relying on economies of scale or cost of input factors as their sources of advantage. So we really see for these low-cost strategies, those businesses feeling the squeeze from COVID-19. So moving forward then, if you're leading one of these organizations, thinking about what can you do to lower those costs similar to what you had pre-COVID-19, knowing that your revenues are still down, so we're trying to recoup some of that value, recoup some of that profitability, or is there potentially a way where you could increase those revenues maybe by pursuing new products or services, so thinking about those growth strategies. Potentially you could achieve more higher revenues or that top line growth while also seeing potentially lowering those costs. So the low cost strategies is for a lot of these businesses really being impacted by COVID-19. So let's move into the final topic, what to do about your current strategy. So as a leader of one of these organizations, what are the things that you can bring back and do to help your strategy really guide you to be able to survive, but potentially also succeed amid COVID-19? So I have this kind of 3-step framework that I would challenge all leaders to think about given this new normal that we're operating in. So respond, recover, and thrive. And I'm going to walk through each one of those. When we think about respond, we're trying to identify pain points in our current strategy. And I've kind of alluded to some of those here. So potentially the pain point is that you've been pursuing a growth strategy and you know that's not going to be feasible, at least for the interim. Potentially your pain point is convenience as a source of your differentiation advantage, and you're really not able to provide the convenience to your customers that you used to be able to have. Or if you're pursuing a low-cost strategy, it's those cost of input factors is really what helped you achieve an advantage. And now with changes in supply chains and difficulties there, you know that you're not going to be able to deliver the way that you used to in terms of providing low costs. So the first thing that we want to do is be able to walk through that analysis to identify the pain points in our current strategy, but then also those potential opportunities for your current strategy. So Maybe there are divestments that need to happen with your business, and so this has really propelled you to be able to quickly and easily identify what some of those divestments are. Potentially a merger with another company might help with you being able to achieve your growth strategy. Potentially leveraging those learning curves, the experience that you have amid this pandemic. So really not just thinking about things that aren't working, but trying to look at what could work in the future. What could we leverage? What could we capitalize on? The second stage would be recovering, and I'm going to walk through this sensing, seizing, and reconfiguring framework that really kind of helps us as leaders be able to identify how we can recover. And then thriving is not about predicting what is going to happen next, but how do we apply the learning that we've accumulated thus far to be able to succeed in this new normal that we'll be operating in at least for some time. So thinking about that first stage then, the responding, so asking, these are the kinds of questions that I would have leaders ask. So can you continue with a growth strategy if that's what you've been pursuing? What are those opportunities or threats in the external environment that will help you be able to grow? Or if you can't grow, pursue a stability or retrenchment strategy. Can you transition to a stability strategy? What would you need to do in order to make that transition successful? Can you pause and proceed with caution? So like I said, pressing the pause button there. Is there a way for you to focus on that profitability still? Focus on that bottom line without necessarily achieving those revenue growth that you've that your strategy maybe previously indicated that you should be pursuing? Or does it make sense for you to pursue a retrenchment strategy? Can you identify areas to divest? The only caution or word of caution that I would have here is remember that some of those areas of divestiture might be critical synergies for the core areas of your operations. So getting rid of those areas might actually put some of the core areas that you maintain at a disadvantage. So I would just kind of caution thinking about the whole organization before any divestitures occur. The second thing to think about in terms of response is that competitive positioning. So do we need to make changes to our sources of differentiation or changes to our low-cost strategy, sources of low-cost strategy? And then how has that landscape of competitors shifted, or will it potentially shift? Is there an opportunity for a merger or acquisition? Does it make sense? Is there going to be some fallout in your industry? So again, we're not trying to predict here, but we're trying to do that analysis now so that when we create our strategy, it will set us up for success now and in the future. That second stage is about recovery. So key activities that strategic leaders must engage in are sensing, seizing, and reconfiguring. So when we talk about sensing, it's really identifying and assessing those opportunities in the external environment, and that's what I've kind of been talking about throughout today's webinar. So as a leader, thinking of coming back to your business and thinking about what's the biggest problem facing us right now, and not necessarily COVID-19, but what has COVID-19 influenced or impacted in terms of our business, and so it's created this problem for us. What's the biggest situational change we face? Yes, we know that COVID-19 is a situational change that we face, but is it decreases in consumer spending? Is it changes in our supply chain? So trying to really drill down to what is that source or that issue within our own business. What's an innovation that, I've been thinking is really cool, and maybe we can figure out a way to apply that innovation to what we're doing right now. I mean, it doesn't need to be some new software program or some new AI interface. Innovation is just about doing something differently. So is there a way that we could do things differently that might help us be successful? What are some things that we should let the competition beat us at? So really getting to those sources of advantage. What are things that we do exceptionally well and we kind of have that moat built around us, and we can let others succeed in other areas, and that's really not going to impact our success in our areas. And then a technology that's struggling to market that maybe we could leverage in our own business. So again, these are just kind of key questions that I would have leaders think about as we're pursuing this sensing stage to try to identify new ways that we could be successful. That second phase is really about seizing, so mobilizing the resources to capture value. So we're not necessarily capitalizing on an opportunity or capitalizing on an element that will create value for us, but what we're trying to do is we're mobilizing our resources, we're moving our resources in a direction to help support that strategy. So this is really that strategic execution. So for every opportunity, how are we going to make money off of it? And when we think about making money, is it driving top line revenue or is it driving that bottom line profitability? Is it increasing our revenues through scale, so we're able to sell more of something, or through price, so we're able to charge a higher price? It would be challenging amid COVID-19, although some organizations really have been able to do this. And then does it lower our costs in some way? So again, the difference between driving top line revenues and bottom line profitability. And then potentially the most important part of this recovery aspect is going to be that reconfiguring. So thinking about continuous renewal in our organization. So how do we re-engineer what we have to be able to seize the opportunity? So I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was working with a healthcare organization, and they had decided that they were going to pursue this new opportunity, but instead of creating a whole new department for it, whole new leadership, which actually would have put them at a disadvantage because those individuals wouldn't have had the knowledge needed to potentially be successful in the history of teamwork, they took two previous groups that had worked in separate areas, taken parts of those two groups, put them together and put them toward this new opportunity. So thinking again how we can reconfigure the resources that we currently have in order to be successful in the future. And then what is obsolete in our organization or near obsolescence that can be renewed that we could use for this new opportunity. So these are all things that are going to help us with recovery. And then that last stage, once we've kind of responded to the pandemic, we've recovered, then we want to think about how can we thrive. And there's kind of two key elements here. The first is to apply our learning. So how are we adapting? Somewhere on the scale between resistance to change all the way to highly adaptive to change. So thinking about where is our organization right now in our ability to adapt? Do we want to be more adaptive? Do we want to be less adaptive? Have there been too many changes? Is it creating chaos? So thinking about how we apply that learning, but then also how has our interaction changed given the changes that have happened with COVID-19? Anywhere from people used to be very independent in their work all the way to high interdependence. I'm seeing this a lot in some of the healthcare organizations that I'm working with. Is that increased interdependence something that we want to keep? So as leaders, how do we facilitate that interdependence when, the pandemic maybe is not as prevalent as it is right now? Maybe we're thinking about 5 years from now. And then the second thing to think about when it comes to thriving is how do we capture new routines or new ways of doing things? So all of this change is occurring outside of our organization. We've walked through this framework of how we might be strategic about changing our strategy and thinking about our strategy amid COVID-19. What is that doing to our existing systems and our existing structure? Are there things that need to change within those existing systems? Do we need new departments for these new opportunities that we're pursuing? Are there changes in our reporting lines that need to happen? So really thinking about how you can capture that newness in your organization so that it can be part of your strategy for success moving forward. So to wrap up, COVID-19 is impacting all organizations, but in very different ways. For a lot of organizations, they're experiencing threats associated to COVID-19. Of course, some organizations are experiencing opportunities related to COVID-19. So first thinking about, for our organization, what are the various threats or opportunities that have been created because of this external force or this external shift that's happened? Successful strategic planning really helps us be able to respond to those changes in the external environment, changes in human resources, in access to capital, in our supply chain. Restore our performance via new ways of operating. Do we want to continue with a growth strategy? Is our competitive positioning, does it make sense given these changes? Or maybe our source of our low-cost strategy, for example, has changed. So how is that going to change our strategy in the marketplace? and then ideas of how to thrive in a new landscape by applying that learning and then also capturing some of these new routines that have been created. So I will leave it at that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I have my email here. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Follow me on Twitter. We can keep this conversation going. I hope some of what I've shared with you today is helpful as you identify ways to respond to this pandemic, to recover performance, but then also thrive in this new future. Thanks for staying with me today.